Greetings, welcome to Facts About Everything. I'm your host, James Egan. Today we're going to look at the most famous person in comic book history, Stan Lee. Although Stan Lee Martin Lieber is 94, he's still going strong. Let's have a look at the Marvel legend. Stan Lee was 38 when he founded Marvel Comics. He was in the army between 1942 to 1945. He is personally responsible for creating 600 characters in comics. Although many fans assume Stan Lee stopped writing comics years ago, he still created new characters every year. When Stan Lee is asked about his success and influence on the comic world, he modestly counters by saying, "I think I was lucky. I did it at the right time." Stan Lee has pointed out that if anyone writes on a comic book, including the original writer, its price will drastically go down. Lou Ferrigno, who played the Hulk in the TV show in the 1970s, asked Stan Lee to sign his issue of The Incredible Hulk issue 1, which was worth about $1/8 million at the time. But since Stan Lee wrote on it, it's not worth much now. Many people ask comic book writers to autograph their comic books, not realizing that they might be losing thousands, sometimes even millions of dollars. Stan Lee has been making cameos for nearly 30 years. His first cameo was in the Trial of the Incredible Hulk. Oh, look at him there. That was such good acting. Many people assume that Stan Lee was bullied as a child, which is what caused him to develop superheroes with psychological problems. Lee has claimed that he had an ordinary childhood, and if anyone wanted to start a fight with me, I would talk them out of it. I would talk so much that they would forget what they wanted to do and leave me alone. While growing up, Lee's favorite authors were Charles Dickens and Mark Twain. It's also worth mentioning that Captain America's favorite author is also Mark Twain. Stan Lee has been trying to make movies out of his superheroes since the 1970s. He was told by Marvel executives, when people don't like the movie, then they won't buy the comic anymore, so I'm not going to take a chance. When Lee saw the success of the Batman and Superman films, he said this was the low point of his career. When Stan Lee was starting out in the comic book industry, people would walk away from him when he told them he was a comic book writer. His nicknames are The Man, Stan the Man, and Generalissimo. His catchphrase is Excelsior! This is also the name of the ship that the Fantastic Four fly in the very first issue. He married Joan in 1947 and has 2 children. They cameo together in X-Men Apocalypse. He calls his fans true believers. Since he lived in New York City for nearly his entire life, he has an incredible understanding of the geographical layout of the city and knows exactly where all the New York superheroes are supposed to live. He doesn't like superheroes who wear capes. I never thought of that. Yeah, it's true. Iron Man, Hulk, Captain America, yeah. He doesn't like fictional towns for superheroes like Gotham or Metropolis. He believes that readers will relate to the characters more if they live in cities and towns that they recognize or live in themselves. He joined Timely Comics in 1939. It eventually became known as Marvel Comics. Stan Lee only got his job at Timely Comics because his cousin was married to the publisher. The first story he ever wrote was Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge, which doesn't make any grammatical sense. Although Stan Lee created most of the greatest characters in Marvel, he has no power over their depictions in any of the films. Stan Lee earns 10% of the profit of all the Marvel films. That means that he earns about $209 million in 2015 and $295 million in 2014. With the continued success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Stan Lee has become the highest grossing filmmaker of all time, since he is the executive producer of every Marvel film, including the ones he did not create, like Captain America and Guardians of the Galaxy. He has made $11 billion. Not bad for a guy in his 90s. The first character Stan Lee ever created was the Destroyer. One of his first jobs was writing obituaries. Stan Lee didn't want to be seen as an anonymous writer. To prevent this from happening, he would write bulletins at the end of the comics and answer questions that readers had. He would also do an article called Stan's Soapbox, where he would talk about whatever he wanted. When asked what is the deadliest and most evil superpower, he said, bigotry and racism. Stan Lee likes to make his superheroes and supervillains have bright, unique colors. Like Mystique, Nightcrawler, and Beast are bright blue, and the Hulk is bright green. He tries to avoid using black, white, or brown colors in order to avoid any connection with a particular ethnic group. Stan Lee plays himself in Mallrats. This was the first and possibly only film where Stan Lee had a lot of dialogue. This made him really nervous, and he was worried that he wouldn't be able to learn his lines. As a result, all of his dialogue was written on a cue card. In the scene, Stan keeps looking away because he's checking to see his next line. He was personally responsible for weakening the power of censorship in the mainstream comic field. After he did this, comics were allowed to deal with matters like drug abuse, alcoholism, and racism. He believed that these issues had to be tackled to educate young readers. He briefly lived with Judy Garland's daughter. He was awarded the 2008 American National Medal of the Arts for his work on comic books. Stan Lee used to play the ocarina. He calls it the sweet potato. He hates the idea of sidekicks, which is why very few of his heroes have them. Captain America's sidekick was Bucky, but Stan Lee did not create Captain America. He has starred in at least 9 films with Chris Evans. He recently started his own comic book company called Kapow Comics. His parents were Romanian Jew immigrants. He is the only actor to appear in every Marvel Cinematic Universe film. He produced his first television show in 2016 called Lucky Man. When he asked why he went by the name Stan Lee instead of his real name Stanley Lieber, he said, "I felt someday I'd write the great American novel and I didn't want to use my real name on these silly little comics." When Stan Lee launched Marvel Comics, he would tell the artist Jack Kirby what he wanted the story to be about. Kirby would then draw the entire story. Kirby would then give the comic to Stan Lee, who would then write in all the dialogue. This is now the most common way for comics to be written. It is known as the Marvel Method. The Marvel Method became famous when Stan Lee wrote a book about it called How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. During the 1960s, Stan Lee was writing, co-writing, or editing every single comic in Marvel. When he was asked how he came up with the idea of mutants being born with their abilities, he said, "The X-Men are basically just me being really lazy. If I said that their powers came from a mutation, that would be it. I wouldn't have to explain it any further." He once created Stan Lee Studios and wrote a comic book about the Backstreet Boys. Unsurprisingly, the studio went bankrupt. Stan Lee desperately tried to get a TV show made with the former Beatles member Ringo Starr as a superhero. Although he does create characters, he doesn't write comics anymore. In fact, he hasn't written a comic since 1972. After that, he became Marvel's publisher. And finally, in 1971, Stan Lee's former collaborator mocked Stan in the comic Mr. Miracle. Stan Lee's character in the comic has a full beard like Stan did at the time. To disassociate from the comic, Stan shaved his beard so he only had a mustache. He has maintained this look ever since. Special thanks to these fine people for all their help. Be sure to subscribe to Facts About Everything. Follow me on Twitter for updates on upcoming videos. Check out my Facebook page to let me know what subjects you want me to talk about in the future. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again.